Good evening and welcome. My name is Carrie Marsh and I'm the director of the Clarke Historical Library. So the Clarke Speaker Series is one of our signature programs and we're really grateful that you're here this evening. This is the John and Audrey Cumming Endowed Lecture, which is a biannual lecture that's part of the Speaker Series. And it honors John Cumming, who is the director of the Clarke for a little over 20 years. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that today we are here on the beautiful lands maintained for generations by the Anishinaabe people, the Indigenous inhabitants of Michigan, with whom we continue to partner today here at Central Michigan University. So I want to let you know about an upcoming event, and please join us if you can for an evening with Nandi Comer, the Poet Laureate of Michigan, on Wednesday, November 6th, 7 p.m. here in the Upperman Auditorium in Park Library. This is a free event and everyone is welcome. And it's the part of the CMU Department of English Language and Literature's Meyer Visiting Writer Series. And the Clarke Historical Library and the University Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council are all co-sponsoring that event. There will be a reception and a book signing afterward in the Clarke, and please know that you all are welcome and share it with your friends. There's also a reception and book signing in the Clarke after tonight's presentation, to which you are all invited, and I hope that you all will be there. So I just have a few bits of housekeeping to share. So first, please mute or turn off your cell phones now. Okay. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be available for later viewing on campus via CMU's Chipcast. By your presence here, you agree that we can put this recorded event online. Because we're recording, we'll have a microphone for you to use during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So please don't shout your question out. Please raise your hand. I'll run over with the microphone so that everyone can hear your question. And I appreciate that. So it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Dr. Blaire Morseau. Dr. Morseau is a citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi Indians and assistant professor in the Department of Religious Studies at Michigan State University, where she's also affiliate faculty in Digital Humanities and American Indian and Indigenous Studies. Before becoming a professor, she worked as her tribe's first full-time archivist, launching an online collections and dictionary website called Pokagon, using Potawatomi cultural protocols of access and traditional knowledge labels. Dr. Morseau consults on various exhibitions and collaborative programs for archives, libraries, and museums around the country, including the Field Museum of Natural History, the Newberry Library, and the Indiana University Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Her research interests are in Indigenous science fiction and futurisms, traditional, cultural, and ecological knowledge, digital heritage, and native countermapping. She's currently working on a new book project titled Mapping Anishinaabe Futurity, Celestial Currents of Sovereignty in Potawatomi Skies, Lands, and Waters, soon to be published by the University of Arizona Press in spring 2025. So Dr. Morseau's recently released edited volume titled As Sacred to Us, Simon Pokagon's Birch Bark Stories in Their Contexts is the focus of her presentation this evening. It features the collection of small books written by 19th century Potawatomi author Simon Pokagon that originally were letterpress printed on birch bark. In As Sacred to Us, Pokagon's books are reprinted with new essays by experts in Native literary traditions, Algonquian languages, history, the Michigan landscape, and materials conservation. These new essays reveal the thousands of years of Indigenous knowledge that Pokagon elevated in his stories. And for you all, at tonight's reception and book signing with Dr. Morseau, we're displaying the Clarke's collection of Simon Pokagon's birch bark books. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Blaire Morseau.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I'm really grateful to be here with you all. Thank you for the invitation and for coming out when it's already dark out. I know this time of year is very tempting to stay inside, watch Netflix, and be in your pajamas, so I appreciate you being out here to listen to me talk a little bit about this edited volume I released last year. But before I get started, if I may, I'll just introduce myself in Pokagon Band of Potawatomi. Good afternoon. Begin, welcome. Bonjour, Kokwe and Dinashnabe Nosman. My name Blaire Morseau. Bodewa mi mina wadawa and da mina Pokagon and Dimendagwas and Kona Dodem. That was just my name in Potawatomi. Just kidding. I said my Anishinaabe name is Nkokwe. My tax's name is Blaire Morseau. And while I'm enrolled in Pokagon Band, I'm also a descendant of Grand River Ottawa, and I'm Bear Clan. So I'm excited to tell you a little bit about this project, which actually is a little bit more than a book project. It also includes a audio component that I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about to increase the accessibility of some of these stories to our community. So I'm excited also to say that in addition to the printed book, you will be able, if you choose to, access our online archive site, We'll-Quepjigan, and I'm happy to provide the URL, where you can either see the digitized scans of our version of the Birch Bark books, as well as hear Pokagon citizens reading each of the stories. Because if you know anything about these stories, you know that they're written in both English with a little bit of Indigenous language sprinkled in, and maybe you don't know how it's pronounced. It can be a little alienated, so it's a lot easier to listen to someone speaking that language, knowing how it's pronounced, the original cadence of the way that oral story used to be told. So, as you already guessed, this project centers on a series of small birch bark books published by Simon Pokagon at the end of the 19th century and posthumously at the beginning of the 20th century. So I'll present a little bit about the books that are specifically held by the Pokagon Potawatomi archives, when I used to steward them in my role as archivist, how these books have inspired conversations and insights about Potawatomi relationships to important places in Michigan, new insights about the Potawatomi language, what we call Bodewa Mingwen. Much of those linguistic insights are shared by contributors to the As Sacred to Us volume by fellow Pokagon Potawatomi citizens, Bemedjoin Kyle Malat and Corinne Casper, who the latter of whom is a linguist at the University of Chicago at the moment. I'll also briefly share some new research by one of the contributors, Dr. Kelly Wisecup, and what she shares in the text about the sort of syndicated print network Simon utilized back when he decided to publish these works over a century ago. And so finally, I hope to demonstrate how, despite Simon's rocky reputation within our own community, his political advocacy demonstrates a form of what I call Anishinaabe futurity that reclaims Indigenous homelands and the stories and ontological relationships Anishinaabe peoples have to those places, all while also carving out space for Indigenous survivance in the future, despite claims back then, and even sometimes now, that of our inevitable extinction. So I already mentioned that the second pillar of this larger project includes recordings of the birch bark stories done with elders and Potawatomi language speakers, which was a project funded by the Mellon Foundation through support by the Less Commonly Taught Language and Indigenous Languages Partnership at Michigan State. So what you're looking at here are a couple of photos of my work as an archivist. Our central idea was not just to keep our items back behind a cold archives room that was inaccessible to people, or even behind exhibits spaces, but to really reintroduce some of these materials back into the community All of these items have a different story about the ways in which they've returned back into our possession, if you will. Some of them were donated by non-native communities, some of them were sold to us by non-native folks, some of them were donated by Pokagon citizens in order to act as a sort of learning tool. And then part of what this also does, some people would call it adding metadata to the items when people are sharing stories or memories or using these as devices to recall important histories and stories about the living memory of our community. So it's also attached to oral history projects. And so specific to this project, prior to the pandemic, if we can remember that at all, I was doing ethnographic research and writing my dissertation about 2017 to 2020. And this is when I was working as my tribe's first archivist. Many of you have heard or indeed have held one of these birch bark books because they're accessioned in a number of institutions around the country, including here at the Clarke, anywhere from the Newberry Library, the Smithsonian, New York Public Library, and more. The most well-known of these titles is the Red Man's Rebuke, or the Red Man's Greeting, which was published in 1893. But this collection at the Pokagon Archives include his other three less well-known titles: Potawatomi Book of Genesis, Algonquian Legends of Paw Paw Lake, and Algonquian Legends of South Haven. The collection also includes other materials related to or created by Simon Pokagon, and was purchased by the tribe from an elderly man named Douglas Fisher, who unfortunately wasn't able to give us much provenance information because he suffered from dementia. But it was clear he took an interest in Simon Pokagon because of the just the vastness of his private collection. And I presented on these birch bark books back in 2018 at the Michigan History Conference, and it was there that I was approached by the then editor-in-chief at Michigan State University as to whether or not I'd be interested in possibly transcribing and republishing the birch bark books so that it could be more accessible to a wider community. Now, I don't know if you've ever read Richard White's well-known text, The Middle Ground, about Indigenous history here in the Great Lakes region, but I bring it up because he mentions that if he had known how much work it was going to be in preparing the book and writing the book, he wouldn't have done it. And sometimes I felt the same way about this project because I had no idea. I mean, my view of what was being asked of me was very myopic in terms of, oh yeah, I'll just transcribe them and add some notes and some contextualizing information and we'll be done. But it took me, about 5 years, I think, to write this, which, you know, for a monograph maybe is not that much, but for an edited collection it was quite a bit. So carefully enveloped between the protective acid-free folders and locked behind the heavy door of a chilly archives room, that are small size, fitting in the palm of one's hand, and the thinness of the paper, bounded by over 100-year-old green silk ribbon, is a deceptive performance of delicacy and fragility. It's deceptive because these books made from thin layers of the bark of white birch trees are indeed strong and durable. As the author himself proclaims, quote, "This most remarkable tree with manifold bark, used by us instead of paper, being of greater value to us as it could not be injured by sun or water," unquote. I should note, however, that after over 120 years, the paper is quite brittle, and due to the laminate structure, tends to break from handling. The As Sacred to Us volume includes a comprehensive discussion by University of Michigan Director of Preservation Services Marika Kay, and co-author and book conservator Owa Shalom in their chapter on materiality and preservation techniques specific to birch bark materials, if that's something you're interested in, but I won't really be talking about it too much in this presentation. So the birch bark books, both as a collection and on their own, are critical sources of 19th century Indigenous intellectual thought. The content of Simon's writing insists on the validity of Indigenous spiritual beliefs, hence the title, As Sacred to Us, the importance of creation stories, as well as the love of land in the context in which he found himself, which was extreme dispossession and a particular brand of American racism informed by late 19th century eugenics movement. So more than just the sum of their parts, however, Simon's texts are not just a quaint series that lament cultural and environmental loss, although it could be read as such. For instance, when Simon compares the disappearance of forests as a result of Michigan's logging industry to the disappearance of Native peoples, alternatively, I argue that the Birch Bark books leverage Indigenous agency and make space for Anishinaabeg in the future, and thus comprise important interventions in Native literary studies and critical Indigenous theory. Simon's Birch Bark books enact what I have described elsewhere as Anishinaabe futurisms, or Indigenous-made speculative film, art, video games, literature, oral storytelling, all of which draws from traditional knowledge in order to envision and convey alternative futurisms. Alternative to what, you might ask? Alternative to narratives deployed by non-natives that primitivized our cultures, oversimplified our politics, and placed us in an imagined past, unable to exist in modernity, let alone the future, which not only wrote us out of history, but wrote us out of said future. So Simon does this while disseminating stories that forefront Indigenous agency, but for those of you unfamiliar with Simon, you might be thinking, well, who was this guy, and why was he so important in the 19th century and in this region? So I'll continue with a little background on the individual for whom these Birch Bark stories are attributed. Simon Pokagon was a 19th century intellectual, author, activist. He was the son of Ottawa and Ojibwe leader Saquanik here on the left. He also was later known as Pokagon, and now a naming convention within a lot of Indigenous communities I'm familiar with is that you may be born with one name, but then you earn another name, perhaps in ceremony, perhaps because of the work you do for your community. There are a number of different ways. So it's not an odd thing to go through life with a number of different names. So Pokagon, there's a couple of different stories about how he came to be known as Pokagon. In Potawatomi, it literally means rib. Now some people say that as part of his jewelry or regalia, he had worn some sort of animal rib in his hair or something. Other people say because he became known as such a prolific leader and protected his village the same way that our ribs protect our internal organs, that's why he had that namesake. Later on, you might notice too the change in naming convention that occurs around the 1830s in this region. This is where we start to see people take on surnames, or rather have surnames put on them. Simon's mother is Katese, who was the daughter of Dotnabi, which means he or she sits quietly, another important Potawatomi leader. So Katese marries Saquanik, and I'll talk a little bit about the history, or we can talk about it at the Q&A. But after being baptized, Pokagon becomes Leopold Pokagon. Katese becomes Elizabeth Totnaby, taking the surname of her father, and then all of their children afterwards have Simon Pokagon, Peter Pokagon, and so on. Oh, and I should note, you probably saw this asterisk here, but there is no painting I've been able to find of Katese, but it felt strange just to have a blank there. So I added a sketch of another Potawatomi woman who lived around that time by the artist George Winter, who in about 1837 hung out with a bunch of Potawatomis in northern Indiana and sketched their likeness. So Simon Pokagon is what we might call sort of a complicated figure. For those folks outside of the Pokagon Band community, you might not know that people don't like him. Simon's celebrated as an intellectual and activist because he was, and he did a lot of amazing things, in my opinion, for his community, but he also did things that were a little odd, like giving the mayor of the city of Chicago a sort of ceremonial deed to the city, which was symbolic, really, but still didn't jive well with his contemporaries in the Pokagon community. And they also saw him as rather boastful, kind of selling visions of him in parades and regalia, and just sort of showing off this bizarre brand of Indianness for non-native folks. And then another thing he did, which was controversial, is his works are often signed Chief Pokagon, or the last hereditary chief of the Potawatomi. And even if he wasn't the one who actually signed his works as such, he certainly didn't argue with people who called him that. And now, we never had hereditary chiefs. That's never been a thing in our community. Although, if you are raised by someone who is a great leader and you share some of those similar qualities in your ability to be diplomatic, intelligent, then it's not outside the realm of possibility that you might also become a known leader, but by birthright, no, that's not a thing. So it's to the point where I've even heard contemporary people today, elders with whom I've worked with and asked if they wanted to be part of this project, what they thought of Pokagon, and they said they thought he was a fraud. So I think that's an important insight, because a lot of times that's not something that's talked about in academic circles or when anyone's using Simon's work. I like John Lau's quote in his book, Imprints. He says that Simon Pokagon, depending on who you ask, is cast as both hero and villain. But nonetheless, Simon Pokagon was an important intellectual. Here are some of his other works that he wrote in some periodicals. And apologies if you can't really see the text. Certainly these slides I can share with you later. But he, for example, wrote pretty passionate pieces in talking about the massacre at Fort Dearborn, saying that, a lot of Potawatomi people actually helped the folks escape there, and just sort of writing back against a lot of the incorrect historical characterizations which painted Native peoples, especially Potawatomi peoples, as savage and barbaric and animals. So he's living in a time where he really has to tell people that he's a full human being and that his culture is not savage, right? Another one of his well-known works is Ogimakwe Mitigwaki, which is somewhat autobiographical. He talks about meeting his wife, having children when he went to school, but some of the events that occur in the novel didn't happen in real life. And it's also a work of temperance, so he was really part of the temperance movement against the evils of alcohol and such. But another similarity with Ogimakwe Mitigwaki is that this novel is predominantly in English, but he incorporates a lot of Potawatomi words, usually nouns, like instead of bear, he'll say mukwa, instead of fish, he'll say gigo, and those sorts of things. And so the last thing I'll mention is that the title for the text, As Sacred to Us, came because I noticed that a number of the Birch bark books ended with something to the effect of, I'm sharing this information with you. This might seem silly to the race that calls themselves civilized, but to us, these stories or these traditions are as sacred to us as Holy Writ to the white race. So as a case in point, here are some of the ways in which he uses language in these two texts. So instead of kiosak, or instead of our forefathers, he'll preface that with the Indigenous term. I'll talk a little bit about the strange writing convention in a moment, but Gjengudo here, the Great Spirit, and so on and so forth. I didn't highlight everything in these 2 pages where he puts the Potawatomi word because I feel like you get the point. So I'll talk a little bit about the construction of these books and why you should care. So I already mentioned that, I mean, it's in the title, these are made out of birch paper. How many of you have ever handled birch bark or birch paper before? So a number of you. So you probably know that it's a laminate structure, you can peel it even smaller. So if you see a beautiful white birch tree, you might be tempted to take off a piece, but then if you look closer, you'll notice that you can peel it even further. And the more you peel it, the thinner it will get, as you can imagine, until it ends up like something like paper. We call birch bark wigwas in Potawatomi, and a similar term that you may have heard of before, wigwam, like our traditional dome housing structures, that comes from that term wigwas because the outer layer of our wigwams use white birch. But apart from that, Simon Pokagon talks a little bit about why he chose this piece of paper, this type of paper over regular paper, right? He says, my object in publishing the Red Man's Rebuke, this is the first title, by the way, that he publishes on birch bark, on the bark of the white birch tree is out of loyalty to my own people, in gratitude to the Great Spirit who in his wisdom provided for us, used for untold generations this most remarkable tree with manifold bark used by us instead of paper, being of greater value to us as it could not be injured by sun or water. And he goes on to talk about how out of this tree they made hats, caps, dishes, and a number of other things. But what's not explicitly mentioned in this text is also the ways in which wigwas was used traditionally for thousands of years to write stories onto in our own communities. It may not have been with a printing press or with alphabet, but with pictographs. So we still use these in ceremony today, most often in the Medewan Lodge. So in a lot of ways, wigwas has always been used to transport stories from place to place, from time to time. So he's part of that long Potawatomi or Anishinaabe literary tradition. In case you haven't seen white birch, because it's been disappearing from this part of the Great Lakes for a couple hundred years now, this is one way that you could go about harvesting it. This looks like she's gotten a nice long piece here. You would cut one end and just kind of shimmy it off and get a nice thick piece, which you can then use for canoe or for tuk, which would be like a container to collect maple sap. There's a number of different ways that you can use it, including in artworks like you're seeing here. And I don't know if you noticed on the cover of the As Sacred to Us text, it includes actually a piece of artwork by Kelly Church, which is a birch bark biting. Has anyone ever heard of a birch bark biting before? Okay, well, they're very fun. They use the thinnest kind of wigwas, and similar to the ways that you may have folded up a piece of paper in elementary school and cut out a snowflake, this is the same way, except you fold up the piece of paper and bite onto it, which sounds a little easier than you would think. It is very hard. And so some of the best artists can make really ornate pictures with this material. And then with something like winter bark, it has this like pectin powdery structure that you can scrape away to reveal a lighter color. So this is some work by Piscone Greg Johnson over in Wisconsin. And then finally another example of a birch bark book, which may have been something that was sold in the tourist trade around the turn of the 20th century. That could have been used as sort of a photograph book or something else. This is in the Pokagon archives. I've looked at it myself and there's nothing written or still in there, although it does look like there was something adhered to it at some point, but I don't know what it is. And you might also notice on the cover that there's something decorating it there in the form of flowers. Does anyone know what those are made out of? Any guesses?
Porcupine quills?
Porcupine quills, exactly. So when we're thinking about we were talking before the program about speculating how many of these birch bark books exist in the world now. Yes, you could look at World Cat, and I think that the last time I checked, Red Man's Rebuke, also Red Man's Greeting, there were like maybe 27 copies, but we don't know how much is in private collection or in the Pokagon Archives case. We didn't catalog it in World Cat, so no one knows we have it unless we tell you. But all that's to say, someone had to go out and harvest this birch bark, and it wasn't Simon. He was really elderly at the time, and also he doesn't talk at all about going out to harvest it. There's a bunch of other reasons. You'll just have to trust me or read the book. But we do know that there's a very robust tourist art market at this time. Michigan is already full of tourist destinations along the coast, and especially Ottawa women are selling their arts, their crafts to non-native tourists. And so it's likely that these unnamed women would have been the artists going out, doing the work to harvest the birch bark, peel them, cut them into pieces that can then be printed on, and so on and so forth. So there's more folks involved in this process than you see copyrights on Pokagon, publisher C.H. Engel, which was Simon's attorney, by the way. And if you're interested at all in the printing process, this work has been done by Fritz Johnson. He's done a lot of the research about where and in what method these were printed. You can review a lot of his research on his website, which is fritzswanson.com. And so birch bark is a very challenging material. It's difficult to produce in large quantities of sheets that are uniform in size, thickness, and surface qualities. And so it's likely these sheets were cut before they went to press, making the sort of more efficient, I don't know the correct term, but the sort of rolling presses that would have been used for newspaper, not practical for this. So each one had to be hand pressed. And so producing enough regular sheets for the multi-handed copy edition would have taken a large and very skilled pool of craftspeople, hence the women I mentioned. The books were probably printed from hand-set type. Evidence suggests that was sourced from the foundry of the Barnhart brothers and the Spindler of Chicago. So Engel had metal stereotypes made, plates made based on hand-set forms for subsequent Pokagon books. He may have done that here as well. And so a lot of people would ask me years ago when I first started giving these presentations about the birch bark books, what kind of press did they use? And I really couldn't say for sure. So with the help of Fritz Swanson and Dr. Kelly Wisecup, they've determined that it was likely the Washington iron hand press, because this would have been the oldest and most traditional style press used by the Hartford Day Spring print shop, where we know the birch bark books were printed. It can take sheets cut to whatever size intended, but it's a very slow process, requiring a lot of hand labor. So essentially, these books are not just publications, right? They're individual works of art. Now on to my favorite part, the stories. What's actually contained in these books, right? So Red Man's Rebuke is very close to what it sounds like. It's a rebuke of what's going on in 1893 in this area of the world. Does anyone know?
Boarding schools.
Boarding schools definitely were happening, yep. There's a specific event, though, in 1893 in Chicago. World's Fair, exactly, also known as the Columbian Exhibition. This essentially, there was lots of World's Fairs, but this was one of the largest and a very poignant celebration of Western modernity. It's a lot like what it sounds like, a large World Fair centered on performance and hoarding goods from all over the world. This is also part of what incentivized anthropologists and archaeologists to loot at reckless abandon in native communities in order to put them on display, in order to found the Field Museum, and so on and so forth. So the World's Fair not only put all of these cultures on display, but for the specific purpose of saying, look how advanced we are compared to all these barbarians around the world. In our great white city, it was literally, Chicago was called the Great White City after it was rebuilt from the fire a couple decades earlier. And with specific attention to Native peoples, literal people were put in exhibit cases as anachronisms, or as people outside of time or in the wrong time and space. So Simon Pokagon's rebuking this, right? He writes this birch bark book in order to talk a little bit about that. There's a number of things he brings up, but I like this quote by Kelly Wisecup, where she says, he brought Indigenous environmental and artistic knowledge into relation with communication practices that U.S. audiences associated with modernity. So here's some images from the World's Fair. I've already mentioned that it's also called the Columbian Exhibition because it's marking, the celebration since 1492, the supposedly discovery of America, right? Right. I should have advanced my slide, but that's okay. So we'll move on, and what breaks my heart about Red Man's Rebuke is this beautiful, what was likely maybe a wood type that was pressed or put in ink and pressed onto this page. And I know you can't see it, but maybe some of you can. There's a scene here with the Chicago River meandering through the landscape, some people in canoes along the river, and a bunch of what looks like teepees. And even though our ancestors didn't live in teepees, even back then, the sort of signifier of Indianness was the teepee, right? So he talks not just about rebuking this idea of native savagery, but also reclaiming Chicago, which is being lauded as this great modern, amazing place built by, only white folks. But he says, even the name Chicago comes from our language. Chicago meaning wild leek, ramp, or onion, and we have stories attached to this place. And it's at the confluence of several waterways that has actually always been a very cosmopolitan place even before Europeans came here. So as I mentioned, this is a unique wood type, and because the image is so faded, the ink, possibly due to the powdery substance that's naturally on birch bark, didn't allow it to last very long. I did a very advanced technique where I put this in paint and redrew where I saw the lines. But I thought it was better that you could kind of see a little bit of the elements in there. And of course it's captioned, Chicago in my grandfather's day. And we think that this wood set type was probably influenced by this painting here, Chicago in 1820. If you do a sort of side-by-side comparison, you can see the river meanders in the exact same way. There are some canoes here. I'm not sure if that one originally included some of these more European-style cabins or the fort here, but maybe one day we'll find out. So, Potawatomi Book of Genesis is probably what you would expect. It's a story about the creation of the original man and woman, how Gajenido, or what's often referred to or translated as the Great Spirit, literally means creating spirit. If you break down the particles of our language, it's usually a lot more complicated and there's more layers of significance than what English can convey. But it talks about how Gajenido crafted them out of red clay and how they emerged from water. And I think what's interesting is some of our sister tribes, like the Meskwaki, their name literally refers to red earth or red clay, sharing that similar story. Another one is Algonquian legends of or South Haven, I'm sorry. And this is an example of the ways in which he forefronts Indigenous place names of cities or towns that are becoming more populated by settlers or that are becoming more popular because they're tourist destinations. And he says that our name for this place was Pokagon, which he translates as earthly paradise. But we see a number of overly romanticized translations in Simon's work because Pokagon literally just means big garden. Probably my favorite one is Algonquin Legends of Paw Paw Lake. So how many of you have been to the Paw Paw area? Yeah, or you've probably driven by there. So in this story, he tells about this catastrophic event that occurs. He says, in the area of Paw Paw, and he gives a little bit more specific information about where exactly he's talking about. He says that there was this great inland bay, and of course we know it's dry there now, and there used to be a village on the coast of this inland bay, and one day there was this loud thundering sound, and all the dogs in the village started whining, and the people were really confused. They thought maybe there was this big thunderstorm, but there were no clouds in the sky. And as they try to figure out what's going on, and they venture off and try to find the source of this sound, they return to the village to find their canoes on dry land. The water had receded so far that they can't see it anymore. And there are fish flopping around in this area which used to contain water. So what's interesting is that I met a geologist while working on this book, and in one of my presentations, I just shared the story, right, and share many inferences about it. And he said, you know, back several decades ago when I was a graduate student, I was doing research there, and I just happened to have read this book around that time too, and I found evidence of the sort of geologic event that Simon talks about. But what's interesting is not just like, oh wow, our oral stories are true, go figure, but that this story is likely about 13,000 years old. And how do we know this? So those of you who might be a little bit interested in sort of the geological events that are occurring around the end of the last glacial maximum may have heard of something called a glacier outburst event or glacier outburst flood, where ice sort of acts like a natural dam on a river or waterway, and then when that fails, it can lead to flooding in one area or the receding of water in another in a very sudden, violent way. And so the more famous example of this occurring is in Missoula. So those of you familiar with Montana might know that Missoula is sort of a bowl shape because it was an ancient lake. And we know that it filled and it burst, I don't know if burst is the right term, several times to the point where when the glacial dam would fail, the water would rush towards almost this entire part of the northwest part of the continent. And we can see scars of this on the landscape. Now, this is not Michigan. This is like in the northwest somewhere, but just to show you an example of how this occurs elsewhere. So, what other parts of our myths or legends are just simply stories that have been passed down for thousands of years, really going against this idea that oral histories are not reliable because they're not written down, right? So as I mentioned at the beginning, if you're interested in reading some of these stories, you can pick up the book, or you can read them on wheelquipchicken.com. I think because we're getting a little low on time, I'll probably skip a bit about the language part of this. Ultimately, we had some questions about why Simon Pokagon makes such glaring grammatical mistakes in the use of the Indigenous language portion of the stories, to the point where people have speculated that he had a ghostwriter and perhaps he didn't even write them. Ultimately, we decided that's not the case. He may have had a heavy-handed editor, but he writes in Ojibwe or Ottawa rather than Potawatomi. And we speculate that this has to do with language ideologies at the time, where, you know, the everyday speech of Potawatomis is not seen as sophisticated as the Ojibwe or the Ottawa written languages, which there are a lot more examples of because these were the first people that the French Jesuits and French traders met at the time. So these were the first languages that were written down. And when I say language ideology, it's the same thing as when we say, like, French is so sophisticated. Well, there's nothing more sophisticated about French than there is of English. It's just our ideas about them. And so this is what we sort of put on Potawatomi versus Ojibwe. Finally, to make this project more accessible and so that people could read or listen to these stories, we have 4 folks reading each of the Birch Bark books that we made available on Pokagon. You can get perhaps just a little snippet here of Majel's very calm and soothing voice reading Potawatomi Book of Genesis. And if you'd like to hear more, you can also find that on Pokagon. And this has nothing to do with my presentation. I just thought it was neat. Usually people laugh. No, but so you can see an example here. Who recognizes this character or where they're from? Star Wars, right? It's the Mandalorian. So, and then the material that this artist has used, perhaps because they're a big fan of Star Wars, is a traditional birch bark material with Anishinaabe designs. And in my work, I look at Indigenous futurity, which sometimes is science fiction, sometimes it's political activism. But overall, this idea of gathering, storytelling, nation building are what I refer to as Indigenous futurisms or Anishinaabe futurity. And it's an important part of the ways in which we refuse to disappear. And I say that, you know, science fiction or speculative fiction is not just escapism, because in order to build a future worth living, you have to envision it first. And maybe we envision it by writing about it or singing about it or telling stories. So with that, happy to take questions. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Blaire. Who would like to ask the first question? I have the microphone. Raise your hand and I'll bring it over to you.
Where did Simon live during his lifetime? More than one place, or?
He mostly lived in Hartford. He was born in Bertrand. So I can't remember the exact year he was born, but I know he died in 1899 in his home in Hartford.
When you harvest the birch bark, do you damage the tree? Does it kill the tree, or does the tree survive?
The tree survives, yeah. So there are artists who know a lot more about how best to do this, like the best methods, but I do know it doesn't kill the tree. Most artists who work with birch bark will not harvest from the same tree twice. Maybe doing so would harm the tree. And if you look at a harvested birch bark, after a few years, it kind of leaves a scar, but this tree continues to grow and it seems fine.
Any other questions? Can you tell us a little bit more about the Pokagon archives? Are they open for the public? Do you have to make an appointment? Where is it? Yeah, tell us more about it.
So they're really building up the program. So there's one archivist, and if any of you have ever worked for a tribe before, or really any small organization, you know you might be called archivist, but you're also exhibit designer, programmer, cataloger. So you have one person doing many jobs, and I say that only because, so in theory, it is open to the public. It's not set up that, you know, there's reading room hours or anything like that. You would really have to make an appointment. So it's located in Dowagiac, which is here. And I'd say it's about a 2-hour drive from here, maybe a little bit more. It's at the Center for History and Culture. There is a very modest exhibit space that changes out every once in a while. Jennifer Kautup-Monk is the archivist now. I'd be happy to share this information via email, but then also because we want to increase accessibility, even if it doesn't mean coming in person. That's why we have Wheelquebjigan as our sort of public-facing online archives website.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question if anyone has a question to ask. Okay. Well, thank you so much again for your presentation. I learned a lot about materials in our own collection, and hopefully I can share that with future classes and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.